So good morning again and welcome to Crumbs Under the Table featuring Luna and Banjo. Let's give you a shot of those two then. Turn this around. There we go, there's Banjo and here comes Luna. So this morning, I was just thinking about there's a well-known verse in 1 Corinthians in the first chapter, about we preach Christ and Him crucified, which is foolishness, isn't it? Well, how does it go? I can't remember. So it's so famous, I'm getting it wrong. Foolishness to the Greeks and stumbling block to the Jews. And we kind of miss the outflow, because the outflow, of course, is very much at the heart of the message. But the outflow of that chapter is actually then how should we live in the midst of all of that. How do we do it? And that's one of the bits that we often get missed. And if we do, we kind of pull out some verses. I've done it myself loads of times. The verse where it says, "Not many are wise," and so on and so forth. Because actually there is a kind of an implication in that which we quite like, which I think is not incorrect, which is that somehow God has, somehow our relationship with the Lord actually changes, starts to give us wisdom. And I think that's true. We start to see the world with greater clarity. Fear of the Lord, acknowledging of the Lord, reverence for the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Things start to fall into place when you see that actually the world was created by a placemaker, someone who's put space for us and made a purpose to our lives. But in the kind of the initial flows of the whole passage, you wind them all together, there's a really good kind of challenge which I find is actually quite tough for me to take on board. I'm saying that in a kind of with an honesty, because I think people who trivialise it probably therefore don't live it. It's kind of like one of those things where, like C.S. Lewis once said, if forgiveness is easy, you probably haven't got anything to forgive. That actually some of these things, if we're honest about them, but we're just often not, are harder than we'd want them to be. And the bit in this particular context is, as kind of Paul moves on from what we preach, for the Jews is a stumbling block, and for the Greeks is foolishness. he kind of pushes on. He kind of says, so the cross, so it is the cross is the context, because that's what they're preaching. And he says, and so the Jews seek a sign, and the Greeks seek wisdom. And both of those things are things at different seasons in my Christian life I have sought. So there have been times where, if you like, in my thinking I've been very Jewish, and in times in my thinking I've been very Greek. So I've seen some, and they're bad things. I've seen some remarkable signs, not least obviously my own healing. I shouldn't be here if it wasn't for the fact that someone came and laid hands on me in hospital when I had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma through 5 parts of my body, and it was now into the spinal fluid, and I was given just months to live. And actually the transformation was so drastic that they had to have a special conference about my case. So I've seen some signs in my own body, and I have a friend who I just saw the other week, who as I said, because I was he's made an opening for me to kind of teach in the university where he does, speaking to his students who aren't believers by any means, but just and I wasn't there to preach at them, I was there to kind of coach them on character and so on. But I made the comment, I said, I've known Phil since he was dead, and I said I'll leave him to tell you that story. So I've seen some remarkable things. I've seen the signs, I've sought the signs. Jews seek a sign, and Greeks seek wisdom. But there are times, you see, because actually sometimes the signs aren't enough. And certainly for me, I've sometimes found, and I found myself flipping between those times. So I've been right in those, the healings and the miracles. Helped organise a healing on the streets in Trafalgar Square a few years back, which is a fantastic time. I've seen remarkable things that the Lord has done. So I've definitely sought signs. But equally there are times when sometimes I realise that's not enough, it's not enough. And so then I start looking for the wisdom of God, and I am astounded at how outside of the gospel there is no wisdom, there is no firm foundation to build anything on in the world. And I just picked up this morning a little clip on YouTube, Facebook thing, a comment where Sam Harris, who's presents himself as one of the 4 Four Horsemen of the Non-Apocalypse as an atheist, alongside with Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and Daniel Dennett and so on. They kind of see themselves in that way as they kind of try and undermine the Judeo-Christian kind of foundations of the philosophy of the Western world. But kind of confessing that actually from a naturalistic point of view, there's nothing wrong with rape. And you think, yeah, this is the problem. It's not dissimilar to watching Richard Dawkins give his views on things like abortion, which he says is less moral, is more moral because it's considered than just eating a pack of bacon because the pig nobody thought about the pig. And so he's trying to kind of come up with a reason for why one thing is moral and another people do. And that's the problem in many ways. And I know our battle, which is not against flesh and blood, feels like it's against flesh and blood. So all of a sudden, you know, what's kind of theoretical and abstract, and I can pray in kind of spiritual warfare, those will do, as long as we've got it. And that's the point, which is you drive through the argument of 1 Corinthians, where actually the choice that we've made to follow, and which from day to day we can go for the power, we can go for the sign, and we can go for the wisdom, and we sometimes have it. But there are also those moments where we realise that actually to answer the situation with either is somehow not right, because, as Paul puts it, because Jesus is the wisdom and the power of God. So the cross, it's not just Jesus, because then we could choose say because actually the whole context is we preaching Christ and Him crucified. The cross is both the power and the wisdom. That ultimately God's power is seen in His ability not to answer with either a sign or with a wise word. So at His trial, as Jesus said, as He'd said previously at His arrest, you know, if I wanted to, I can ask the Father for a legion of angels. It's not a question of have I got it. And so sometimes the seeking of the sign has helped me understand, know that God really can. He really can. He can always outpower people, but He doesn't always. And that's the important thing here. And equally, is it that He's not got the wisdom to answer these clever arguments against us? Well, yes, He has, but He doesn't always need to give an answer. Because the wisdom and power of God is sometimes to allow itself. And when I say sometimes, I think it's often at the most important moments. It's the most defining moments sometimes of our walk with the Lord and our faith in Him. It comes to those points where somehow the wisdom and the power of God is seen in our silence and our acceptance. And actually we allow, because that is of course the power of the cross in the end, it's the thing that undermines the Roman Empire, and not just the Roman Empire, but it undermines system after system of worldly wisdom and worldly authority. It doesn't do it by outwising them and outpowering them. It does them actually in kind of a place of appreciative submission, appreciative love for the life we've got, the things God's given us. And I think there's something really, really important to get hold of, particularly as we move into more and more turbulent times, and they're not going to turn off as soon as this year's over and Brexit is finally decided. I say finally decided. Who knows how long it will take. It's not going to all disappear when that happens, because actually thing after thing is already in the pipeline if you care to look. Huge numbers of economies in Europe are so incredibly fragile at the moment, and all of the new tech companies has been started to be seeing more and more comments, and it's not dissimilar to when the housing market crashed. But so many of they're beginning to commentary voices on the fact that they're actually all losing money. It's only the ones that from a generation ago that established a model where they burnt huge amounts of money in the early days to kind of win such an enormous part of the global share, like Amazon. Everybody's now trying to do that, and loads of investment money and people's pension money is being invested using the same model that worked for Amazon but is not working for Uber, who may well go bust in about November. That's one prediction I saw, and umpteen other companies along the same lines. And when those things happen, it's not just old fat cats. It's actually, of course, that's people's retirements. So we've got a whole load of stuff kind of coming that is looking more and more complicated, and And as technology increases, it means that things that used to be the proviso of governments only suddenly come into the hands of those who just got the finances and the will and the money, and smaller governments. I don't see the world becoming more stable, let's put it that way. But I don't want to say that as a fearmonger. And I see also sown into a generation a mentality where a mentality that's being taught to look, which sounds noble, taught to look for prejudice, but actually has become so good at seeing it that everybody in one sense is criticisable from the outside. There's always a way of cutting every situation. Why? Because at the end of the day, there are always some people doing well and others doing badly. And there's always a way of explaining that as being somehow beyond them, because actually the world is beyond us, that's true. And so in the end we end up smashing everything up and having less than our parents did because we didn't like the way our parents got what they got. And so as I say, I'm not trying to write a kind of a political polemic. I'm just saying I don't see things getting better. And so the challenge in that context is, how should we be? And the temptation will be, well, do you know what? I've seen God do incredible, powerful things, so I'm going to look for power. And I've seen God with incredible wisdom and arguments, and we see, if you like, and go online, you look at brilliant clips of people like Ravi Zacharias and so on, really smart minds actually kind of highlighting, because actually there is wisdom in God. He is the beginning of all wisdom, and He is actually the source of every miracle. And those things are true, but actually, ultimately, if we want to understand our Maker, we have to understand the cross, which is, when it comes to it, the imposition of itself against the will of others is something that God actually seems to retreat from, not because He has to, because He really doesn't, but because actually He's setting a model for us, which in the end is the foundation of all fruitful, productive, kind society. It's not doing something because it must and because it's the best. It does it just simply because this is the best way to express power and wisdom. The best way to express power and wisdom is to make way for those others who you actually value. If you value them, you make way for them, even when they're wrong and even when they're doing something destructive. And of course the incredible testimony of the cross is not instantaneous, but actually it releases a force that actually almost everything that's good in the modern world and in any of our political systems you can trace back to a gospel origin. It releases a testimony into history, into the flow of history, which is not instant. Sometimes we don't see it in our lifetime, but if we hadn't done what we did, if we hadn't sown our lives, if we hadn't actually in that context somehow identified with the cross that says, I'm going to let the Lord battle on my behalf, I'm not going to pursue Him for power and wisdom to do my answer, my thing, and then actually I believe in the long term we will see more ultimate fruit. I might see a bit more of what I want right now, and I believe that what I want is kind of what the Lord wants, but equally what I want has always got a limited perspective on it. I can't see the whole picture, and so somehow I have to come to that place of faith. I have to come to that place where I look at the situation that the world is in, and that doesn't mean don't speak your wisdom and nor pray for the miracles. What I'm saying is ultimately is to identify with an attitude of heart that says sometimes the way that evil is undermined is to let it have its own way, which is part of the way that the cross works. In the end, I did a thing the other day which I ended up calling, I didn't call it that when I was walking around, but with the dogs, about evil will eat itself. Because that actually is what happens, is when God withdraws His hands, when He allows Himself to be pushed out of the equation, then suddenly what we discover is that actually evil self-consumes. And I think there are those times where with wisdom we have to learn, when is it right to be salt and light, to bring the miracle, to bring the wisdom, and when is it time to say, okay, I need to withdraw. I'm not going to cast my pearls before swine. And it's really hard, because we can get angry about what's going on, we can care about what's going on, but there are those times when actually the best way through is to take a step back And you have to understand, as I say that, as I'm someone who advocates that people get involved in politics. I advocate that people get involved in their local school boards. You know, I'm an advocate for engagement and the leavening of society, because the truth is, Jesus did do signs, and believers do see signs. The truth is, Jesus does teach wisdom, and believers have seen incredible wisdom that have been quite genius things. But the thing is, when that becomes more important than the personality of Jesus, who is expressed in the cross, and the cross is the ultimate expression of God's power and wisdom, then we have to understand that we will occasionally hit those times where the expression of power and wisdom is to stay silent and let things happen. So I kind of feel, even as I'm talking to myself, how much that winds me up. Just being really honest, that winds me up to think I have to stay silent and do nothing. That somehow, for God to sort the situation out, we have to recognise that one of the ways he does it is in with the withdrawal from the power and the withdrawal from the wisdom. Not withdrawal from them, but the withdrawal of those things from the mix. And so, as I say, I can't tell you when that moment will happen. For each one of us, it might happen at a different kind of moment, but I have a suspicion that as we go forward, we're going to find more and more of those occasions. Time to stay silent. There is a time for the sign, but a time for submission. There is a time for wisdom, but a time for silence. And I suspect that we're moving into an age where God's real purposes will be done by those who have allowed, if you like, their pursuit of the wisdom and the power to take them into a position where suddenly, just like with Jesus, now is the time to stop. Now is the time to take it so far and then to be silent. So I'm thinking to myself, if I was listening to this, would that be a popular message this morning? I'm not so sure. But I speak it to myself because I want to find the right way, not just my way. You know, it's that classic old kind of issue. So I know there are things that are good for me and they look kind of godly, but that isn't necessarily the right way. So anyway, after that sobering thought for this morning, and my prayer is it's kind of wisdom you can tuck away. Ooh, it's wisdom, power that you can tuck away. The cross is wisdom and power. It is. It just doesn't look like the way we think it would be. That silence is the best thing to say in some occasions. That doing nothing is the most powerful thing to do in some situations. And so we have to take that on board, because that is at the heart of our message, the heart of our gospel. So anyway, those are my thoughts this morning as we kind of get to the corner of this field. Oops, there's a truck in the next field. But anyway, I will say goodbye for today and look forward to being with you again tomorrow. So until then, all the best. Blessings on you, wisdom and authority for today, including the wisdom and authority to do very little. In Jesus' name, amen.